The films of Yasujiro Ozu depict the truth of families, in the way that situations are almost never addressed head-on, and how painful it can be for us to reveal and speak truths to the people we are closest with. We can see this in two of his best-known films, 1949's Late Spring and 1962's An Autumn Afternoon. These two films share not only a common plot. Several familiar faces from Ozu's repertory pop up in both films. Ryu Chishu plays the father in both. Shujimaru Haruko and Miyaki Kuniko. Late Spring has often been described as the first major work of the final part of Ozu's post-war career. Whereas the previous two films he had made in the wake of Japan's defeat in 1945, The Record of a Tenement Gentleman and A Hen in the Wind, both focus on the immediate aftermath of the war and the hardships endured by the Japanese people, Late Spring only makes passing reference to the war. Instead, it's Ozu's return to the shomengeki genre, meaning dramas centered on ordinary working-class people, which had made him famous in the first place. In between Late Spring and Autumn Afternoon, he would make some of his best-known and most critically acclaimed films, like Tokyo Story, The Flavor of Green Tea Over Rice, and Floating Weeds. An Autumn Afternoon, one of several of Ozu's remakes or variations on the basic plot of Late Spring, was Ozu's last film, as he died of cancer in 1963. These two films span the length of the final major period of Ozu's career. Both films tell the story of an upper-middle-class widowed father, Shukichi in Late Spring and Mr. Hirayama in An Autumn Afternoon, who lives with his adult daughter, Noriko and Michiko, respectively. A daughter who acts as a stay-at-home caretaker, cooking and cleaning for her father. However, social pressures from an assortment of friends and family members encourage the father to arrange a marriage match for his daughter. Both daughters have what seems to be a love interest, who later proves to be already engaged, forcing the father to arrange a blind match. While both daughters initially resist this match, they finally succumb to these outside pressures, and, on their wedding day, wearing almost identical dresses, they poignantly thank their father for providing them for all these years, before heading out to a wedding and a groom that we, the audience, never see. In the final scenes of both films, the father returns to the home he once shared with his daughter, now disconsolate and truly alone. Though the films are very similar structurally and thematically, Ozu, like a great painter, finds in their smallest nuances important distinctions and differences which set them apart. Much like a painter might return to the same spot, the same vista on different days to reproduce a painting in every different kind of daylight, Ozu returns to the same basic story and structure to find new ways of telling it and commenting on it, and new ways of exploiting its emotional pressure points. Even the two films' titles, Late Spring and An Autumn Afternoon, evidence this repetition of theme and viewpoint in their grounding in the time of day and the season. According to film critic Lars Martin Sorensen, the title Late Spring can refer to the fact that Noriko is 27, unusually old for an unmarried woman, and approaching the end of her youth, or her spring, and thus the end of her usefulness as a wife. Noriko at 27 is distinguished from Michiko, the daughter in An Autumn Afternoon, who is only 24. Though their relative difference in age is small, the thin window of time in which women are expected to marry in Japanese culture gives even more weight to Noriko's need to marry, and informs the mournful tone which pervades Late Spring. Though it must be noted that the film's original Japanese title can be roughly translated to The Taste of Mackerel Pike, referencing a dinner scene in the film in which a character joyfully discovers a new type of seafood. The title, An Autumn Afternoon, suggests an even darker and more dire predicament for its characters. With Late Spring, there is still a sense of urgency, but we are in the springtime, and thus Noriko's decision still has meaningful and fruitful consequences. But in autumn, approaching winter and the literal and figurative end of growth, we have to ask if the characters' decisions are of any consequence. What do they have to win or lose if all already seems lost? This question is supported by the film's more cynical and ironically detached tone, as well as its less flattering portrayal of its protagonist. While Late Spring focuses heavily on the relationship between Noriko and her father, in Autumn Afternoon, Shukichi has 3 children, and as a result this offsets the heartbreaking element of Late Spring. While Shukichi loses a daughter, her loss does not represent an absolute self-sacrifice on his part that Noriko's loss does for her father. There are also more supporting characters, and the film's widened scope allows it to comment on other aspects of the social environment that it exists in. For example, in one notable scene, Shukichi meets a former World War II brother-in-arms who takes him to a whiskey bar, where they drunkenly perform a military march. The effects of war on the characters in Japan is far less explored in Late Spring, aside from a mention of Noriko's health issues developed doing forced labor during the war as a cause of her celibacy. While war is barely mentioned, some scholars argue that certain small moments, such as the Coca-Cola sign and the load capacity sign for trucks which Noriko passes on her bike ride, are subtle reminders of the ongoing American occupation. American censors forced Ozu to change elements of the script during pre-production, and this might explain a focus on Shomengeki drama over political commentary. Later in an autumn afternoon, after seeing his daughter off, Shukichi returns to the whiskey bar alone. As the military march is played again, two other patrons mockingly reenact the wartime radio broadcasts. As the film was made after the end of the occupation, Ozu uses scenes like this to ironically mirror previous ones. Shukichi himself now inhabits the role of the drunk former soldier, unable to reconcile his complex emotions and displacement in a modernizing world, which is not interested in resurfacing its past. The film depicts this modernization in other ways as well. Contrary to Noriko's compliant devotion to her father, the young women of An Autumn Afternoon are far more headstrong and forthright in their opinions. Michiko often chastises her father and brother Kuzo for not helping her clean around the house. Michiko wears the traditional kimono, signaling her devotion to the family unit, while her sister-in-law, Akiko, wears modern clothing and seems to live in something approaching an equal partnership with her husband. While modernizing elements exist in late spring, in Noriko's divorcee friend Aya, and in Mr. Onodera taking a second wife, Noriko's resistance to marriage signals a conservatism and a regressive desire to step away from a modernizing society, away from adult maturity, and towards a perpetual childlike state. Noriko can be seen as the embodiment of a past Japaneseness and insularity towards which some long to return. Her acceptance of the natural order of things by the film's end signals more a sacrifice made out of respect for her father than a true reconciliation with society. The conflict arises from Noriko's complex role in her father's life, at times a caring mother, jealous wife, and devoted child. Autumn Afternoon externalizes the father's conflict, foreshadowing his and Michiko's potential fate through the character of the Gourd, the father's old middle school teacher, now a drunkard, and his daughter, whom he regrets having turned into an old maid. Still, avoiding the Gourd's mistakes, the father ultimately winds up reminiscent of him, drunkenly singing old war songs in the dark at the film's close. The memories of his war experiences, which only surface decades later, as well as his uncertainty in his place in the future, leave him in an unsteady present. In late spring, we leave the father in a moment of unredeemed sadness and seemingly inconsolable grief, whereas in An Autumn Afternoon, an unrelenting modernization does not even allow that quiet contemplation, and instead forces the character or towards irrelevancy. The films of Ozu give us a vision of life that is at once beautiful and heartbreaking, and yet unsentimental and painfully realistic. Perhaps this is why they are important. They create characters who feel so vividly real and true, yet they do not spare these characters the pain of their journeys, and they do not afford them tidy resolutions. It's a cinema that suggests the possibilities of life, and that's what makes the characters' meek acceptance of their fate all the more powerful. As Mr. Hirayama says to Noriko near the end of late spring, "You're starting a new life, one in which I play no part. That's the order of human life and history. To expect such immediate happiness is a mistake. Getting married isn't happiness. Happiness lies in the forging of a new life shared together."